Tonight we begin with a development that Western intelligence officials had feared, dismissed, and ultimately prepared for. A disappearance that unfolded not over months of grinding warfare, but in 72 hours. 72 hours that erased some of Russia's most decorated fighting forces from the battlefield. 72 hours that left equipment scattered across kilometers of scorched earth. 72 hours that changed the calculus of this war in ways Moscow is still struggling to comprehend. What Russian military commanders did this week crossed a line that NATO planners had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Ukrainian forces did not hesitate. They responded with precision, coordination, and overwhelming lethality. The satellite images now emerging tell a story that Russian state media cannot spin, that Kremlin spokesmen cannot deny, and that military families across Russia are only beginning to understand. Elite units, the pride of the Russian military machine, have vanished without trace. And tonight, we have the evidence. For weeks now, there had been signals, not official communiques, not formal military dispatches, just signals that Russia was preparing something extraordinarily ambitious in the eastern sector. Russian forces have been aggressive, yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a cadence, almost a choreography that Western analysts had learned to read. But what set off alarm bells in Kiev and Washington this month was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian troop movements know the indicators: the repositioning of logistics convoys, the concentration of electronic warfare assets, the sudden increase in encrypted communications, the unexpected silence from units that typically broadcast their positions through careless radio chatter. All of that went quiet. And whenever Russian elite forces go quiet, it means something is about to get loud. The units in question were not ordinary conscript formations. These were the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, elements of the 810th Guards Naval Infantry Brigade, and most significantly, components of the 76th Guards Air Assault Division. Units with histories stretching back to Soviet glory days. Units that had been rebuilt and reinforced multiple times since the invasion began. These were the forces Moscow trusted for breakthrough operations. These were the forces that were supposed to punch through Ukrainian lines and deliver the victory the Kremlin desperately needed. Instead, they walked into something they never saw coming. Early Tuesday morning, commercial satellite imagery providers detected what they described as catastrophic thermal signatures across a 12-kilometer front, including vehicle concentrations that had not been observed in that sector in over 4 months. These are the kinds of force deployments that Russia only commits when they are signaling something very specific: a major offensive push, a strategic repositioning, or a last-ditch attempt to break a stalemate. NATO observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Russia was changing its entire operational posture, and when a military power shifts posture without explanation, even by small measures, every intelligence agency pays attention. The satellite images from Wednesday told a different story entirely. Where formations had assembled, there were now debris fields. Where armored columns had staged, there were now thermal signatures consistent with burning vehicles, dozens of them spread across what should have been secure rear areas. The before and after imagery was stark, it was damning, and it was undeniable. The intelligence assessment issued by Ukrainian Military Command Wednesday night was not normal, it was not routine, it was not symbolic, it was urgent. Briefer after briefer in secure facilities across NATO capitals described Russia's attempted offensive as poorly coordinated, tactically flawed, and perhaps most importantly, strategically catastrophic in ways that Moscow had not anticipated. Russian commanders had relied on speed and surprise to overwhelm Ukrainian positions. But speed and surprise only work if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response this week was among the most devastating combined arms operations we've seen since the liberation of Kherson. Here's what we know. Within hours of detecting the Russian buildup, Ukrainian forces activated a layered defense system that included precision artillery, drone swarms, and long-range strike capabilities that had been quietly positioned weeks in advance. These weren't the improvised responses of early 2022. These were coordinated kill chains, integrated systems that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to annihilate an advancing force, and annihilate they did. Tonight, Ukrainian military intelligence confirmed that their forces launched precision strikes on Russian staging areas, including a forward command post that had recently been relocated from Luhansk Oblast for what analysts believe was direct coordination of the offensive. Ukrainian artillery found their targets before Russian armor could disperse. They hit fuel depots that would have sustained the advance. They hit ammunition stockpiles that detonated for hours afterward. They hit communication nodes that were likely coordinating between multiple brigade-level formations. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of the entire operation, the command structure that would have made it functional. This is what made the initial intelligence warning so urgent. Russia's troop concentration wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of massed assault that could have broken through defensive lines if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't waste ammunition on decoys. They didn't disperse their fire across the entire front. They hit command nodes, they hit logistics arteries, they hit the elite units that Russian generals cannot easily replace. The 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, which had been rebuilt at tremendous cost after earlier losses, appears to have suffered what one analyst described as organizational destruction, losses so severe that the unit may no longer exist as a coherent fighting force. The 76th Guards Air Assault Division, veterans of Chechnya and Syria, were caught in what Ukrainian sources describe as a fire pocket, unable to advance, unable to retreat, and unable to call for support because their communication infrastructure had already been destroyed. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence officials now believe that Russia's latest offensive was designed to test the resilience of Ukrainian defenses after months of attritional warfare had supposedly degraded their capabilities. Moscow wanted to see whether Ukraine would buckle under concentrated pressure, but instead the opposite happened. Ukrainian forces didn't buckle. They executed a defensive operation that was so swift, so lethal that even Russian military bloggers noticed. You don't get the attention of the Russian military commentariat easily. But this week, Ukraine did. Russian military analysts speaking on Telegram channels under pseudonyms described the offensive's failure as systemic, a way to deflect blame from any single commander while acknowledging that something had gone catastrophically wrong. But Ukraine proved this week that they remain both capable and adaptive. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were sequenced so precisely that Russian forces couldn't establish any coherent response before the next wave arrived. That sequencing matters because it shows something Western planners have been hoping to see. Ukraine has not just received advanced weapons, they have integrated them into a doctrine that multiplies their effectiveness. It shows that Ukraine is not just surviving, they are learning faster than their enemy. As reports continued coming in throughout the week, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian artillery units carried out over 400 fire missions in a 48-hour period, forcing Russian formations to abandon prepared positions. Drone units targeted supply convoys that had been staged in supposedly secure rear areas in the last 72 hours. Special operations forces operating behind Russian lines reportedly destroyed a mobile command post used by Russian commanders to coordinate between multiple attacking formations. This wasn't just defense. This wasn't just holding the line. This was systematic destruction. This was battlefield dominance, and battlefield dominance is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failure of their initial assault on Kiev. For every territorial advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that bleeds Russian forces of equipment, experienced soldiers, and most critically, time. The satellite imagery tells this story in stark visual terms. Commercial providers have identified at least 47 destroyed or abandoned vehicles in a single 3-kilometer stretch. Thermal imagery shows burn patterns consistent with ammunition cooking off inside armored vehicles, suggesting these weren't controlled retreats but catastrophic kills. Russian forces didn't withdraw. They were destroyed in place. Remember, Russia thought this offensive would demonstrate renewed capability. They thought concentrated force would overwhelm Ukrainian positions weakened by winter fighting. They thought Western attention had wandered, that support was flagging, that this was the moment to strike. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Western partners are accelerating deliveries. Ukrainian morale appears stronger than at any point since the autumn, and Russian elite units, the formations Moscow cannot afford to lose, are burning in fields their commanders promised would be easy conquests. The historical parallels are uncomfortable for the Kremlin. This is not how the Second Army in the world was supposed to perform. This is not how elite naval infantry and air assault forces were supposed to be employed. And this is certainly not the outcome Russian generals briefed to their president. What makes this moment so consequential and so dangerous is that Russia's latest offensive happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under enormous domestic pressure. Hawks in the Russian military establishment want escalation. Pragmatists in the economic ministries want stabilization. Nationalist voices want visible victories to justify the war's continuation, and ordinary Russians want their sons and husbands to come home. Putin is balancing these demands while prosecuting a war that has already exceeded every reasonable cost-benefit calculation. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. The decision to commit elite units to what was clearly a high-risk offensive suggests desperation, not confidence. It suggests that Moscow needed a victory badly enough to risk forces it could not replace. And now those forces are gone. NATO's assessment, now circulating among member states, was designed to signal that the alliance is not willing to allow Russian aggression to succeed through brute force. Alliance officials said plainly that Russia's offensive was inconsistent with any sustainable military strategy. That is diplomatic language for, they threw away their best units and got nothing in return. You don't usually hear that tone from NATO military officials unless something significant has shifted. The Pentagon's response was similarly direct. A senior defense official, speaking on background, described the failed offensive as tactically incompetent and strategically counterproductive. These assessments matter because they shape what comes next. If Russia's elite units are truly degraded, the pressure on Moscow to seek alternatives, whether escalation or negotiation, increases substantially. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a measured, resolute speech tonight. He said, "Our defenders have proven once again that no amount of Russian aggression can break the spirit of a free people." He said, "The enemy sent their best. Their best was not enough." And he said, "Every Ukrainian who stands in defense of our land writes a chapter of history that future generations will honor." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky knows that this week's success must be followed by sustained pressure. He knows that Russian planners are already studying what went wrong, and he knows that the next test may come sooner than anyone expects. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's latest offensive wasn't isolated. Along with the ground assault, Russian naval forces also conducted provocative maneuvers in the Black Sea. Russian cyber units intensified attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. Russian diplomatic channels increased pressure on wavering partners, targeting nations that have supported Ukraine with warnings and economic leverage. All of this happened within the same week. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. The failed ground offensive may have been one component of a broader strategy that hasn't yet fully materialized. Or it may have been the centerpiece, the decisive blow that was supposed to change the war's trajectory. Either way, its failure creates ripple effects that Moscow cannot control. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing a second offensive wave using reserve forces held back from the initial assault. Another is that Russia is attempting to reframe the failure as a deliberate reconnaissance in force to test Ukrainian defenses, a face-saving narrative that doesn't match the scale of losses. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to create conditions for escalation, using battlefield frustration as justification for more extreme measures. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for Russian forces to establish themselves. They didn't allow a foothold that could be reinforced. They didn't give Moscow time to spin the narrative. They destroyed the offensive in its opening phase. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Russia wants to see whether battlefield losses will translate into Western fatigue. Ukraine wants to show that every Russian escalation will be met with devastating response. NATO wants to prevent the conflict from spiraling into direct confrontation, and Putin wants to prevent the recognition that this war has become unwinnable. All of these objectives are now colliding in ways that make the coming weeks extraordinarily important. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are now monitoring Russian force dispositions across the entire front. They say Russian units are showing signs of confusion, with communication intercepts suggesting commanders don't fully understand what happened to adjacent formations. They say Russian logistics networks are struggling to adjust to the loss of forward staging areas. And they say Russia's decision to commit elite forces was likely part of a broader strategy intended to demonstrate capability before potential negotiations, a demonstration that has now backfired spectacularly. But Ukraine is not celebrating prematurely. In fact, Ukraine is reinforcing success. Their response this week, swift, precise, and overwhelming, sent a message to Moscow that the costs of aggression will only increase. And it sent a message to Western partners that their support is being translated into battlefield results. As the week goes on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russian commanders hope to achieve. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It prevented a potential breakthrough, it destroyed irreplaceable elite formations, and it demonstrated that defensive capabilities remain robust despite months of intense fighting. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next several weeks. If they attempt another major offensive, this moment will be remembered as a warning they failed to heed. If they pause to reconstitute, Ukraine and its partners have already shown they are prepared to maintain pressure. They have shown they are ready to respond, and tonight, for the first time in months, Russian military command appears to be recalculating. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet, and when Moscow is quiet, it means they are processing. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because this week, Russian commanders learned something they should have learned long ago. Elite units are not invincible. Concentrated force is not a guarantee of victory. And Ukraine will make them pay for every kilometer they try to take. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Russia's best units vanished in fields they expected to conquer. Satellite images have documented what Moscow cannot admit, and the war that Putin promised would last days has become a conflict that consumes Russia's military future, and we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.